We're now going to be talking about the development of the food traditions on the Italian peninsula from the late Middle Ages into the Renaissance. And if you remember back to the map I showed you of Italy and how it was divided into three parts, with the south being controlled by foreign powers, a big chunk of central Italy being controlled by the Papal State, and then the north being divided into city-states. And one of the reasons that's important is because different food cultures develop in these city-states, and cities become important centers for different food traditions. This is particularly true of the north, but also true in the south. On top of that, in the Renaissance, what we see happening is that the city-states are these cultural centers in cities are enfolded into regional territories. And you can see this on the map. You see larger territories in the map, but still very fragmented. And you have regional food cultures developing as well. And this is what, in particular, what you see in the South. You see more regional food cultures than specific city food cultures, with the exception of Naples. Naples develops a very famous food culture. So in your reading, you'll be reading about different intellectuals, writers, cooks, chefs, who were describing the developing food cultures of the Italian peninsula in the Renaissance. And one of the things that we want you to remember is that the diversity of these different city and regional cultures begins in this period, begins in the 15th century, in the 16th century. So when we talk about these local urban food cultures or regional cultures in contemporary Italy, it's important to remember that their histories go back to this time period. They go back to the 15th century. They go back to the 16th century. And sometimes they even go back to the Roman Empire, or even back, well, we won't go there. But anyway, they're very long traditions with deep, deep roots. Right? And they're also in competition with each other. The other thing I want to point out before I go on is that a lot of these regional cultures have courts, and chefs work at these courts, and they're some of the primary writers about Italian food during this period. And what they describe to us is this rich network of different food traditions, but also a dialogue that's going on within these networks between peasant traditions, the traditions of people who actually work the land, and the traditions of the court. Right? So we can see this also in some paintings. And one of the reasons we want to look at these paintings is that we can see one of the central characteristics of all the food cultures on the Italian peninsula, and that is that vegetables are important, and they're often even more important than meat and fish. Right? It's an important part of the Mediterranean diet, an important part of all the Italian food traditions. So this is a painting by Annibale Carracci from Bologna. It's called The Bean Eater. It was painted between 1580 and 1590 during the Renaissance period. And if you've ever seen Renaissance portraits, most of them focus on wealthy, powerful people. And they show off their wealth and power with their jewelry, with their luxury clothes. And this is a very different kind of portrait for the period. And we're not really sure why Carracci decided to paint a peasant eating. Some people some scholars believe that he's satirizing peasants, but he clearly thought it was important to memorialize this peasant dinner. And we can see the beans, we can see the bread, we can see onions. And onions were particularly connected with peasant culture. Nobles, courtiers did not want to eat onions because of the smell. And what we know now about onions and garlic is that they're very healthy. They're full of antioxidants, and they're good for us, and the smells indicate that to us. But at the time, they were connected to peasant culture, so the nobles wanted to avoid them. One of the interesting things that happens in Italy during this period is that there's this dialogue that goes on between peasant culture and courtly culture, and the courts start preparing more vegetables and start seeing them as being equally important to meats, which were considered more noble, or seafood that was considered more noble. And they might add spices to them, but they're considered important parts of these courtly traditions, or important parts of the diets of people, not only of peasants, but of wealthy people. So an example of this in a painting is a painter from Piacenza, once again from the north, Felice Boselli, and his name in Latin is his name Felice is close to the Latin word for cat, so you'll always see a cat in his pictures. It's a reference to himself. But what really stands out in this painting, there's also fish in the painting, but what really stands out in this painting is the rich array of vegetables, right? And even onions are in this painting. Now, Boselli created these paintings, sold these paintings to wealthy people who owned property. And it was a way of them celebrating the bounty of their land, right? So here we see wealthy people celebrating vegetables. And once again, traditionally, the wealthy had associated themselves with meat, with fish. Those were considered more, especially certain kinds of meat and fish, but those were considered the superior foods. But in Italy, this paradigm changes and vegetables become increasingly more important. So, moving on, there are two maps on your screen. One is of Italy in the Renaissance period to your left. The other is of Italy at the time of the unification. The unification of Italy, the date given is 1861, but the unification of what we know today as Italy goes well into the 20th century. It goes well, excuse me, goes well into the 20th century. So I wanted to put these two maps side by side to show you that Italy really remains fragmented politically, linguistically, culturally, and also in terms of cuisine up until unification. Right? Also, with these two maps are two maps of contemporary Italy. With the map on the left, I wanted to show you a few of the geographical characteristics of the peninsula, which are really important for food culture. The food on the map, not the food, only if. The map on the right is a map of the contemporary regions of Italy. So starting with the map on the left, I want you to notice the two mountain ranges, the Alps. And remember that most of the period in which Italian food was developing, transportation was not easy. People did not have planes. They did not have trains. And so this was a real barrier, and is one of the reasons that Italian food culture develops somewhat differently than other European food traditions. And also the other mountain range, the Apennines, that forms the spinal cord. Let's see if I can do this. The spinal cord of the Italian peninsula, and once again divides the island. Not the island, the peninsula. And it's one of the reasons that Italy has so many local, distinct food cultures. I also want to point out the Po Valley, which is right here between the Alps and the Apennines, because that's a very rich, fertile area. And we'll be talking a lot about the cities in the Po Valley. We'll be talking about Bologna. We'll be talking about Modena. We'll be talking about Parma. And so it's important to remember that those are all cities in the Po Valley. Going to the other map, we don't expect you to memorize all the names of regions in Italy, but they'll be constantly referred to in your readings. So it'd be good to keep a map out and to refer back to it. And we talked about the fact that there are differences, historical, economic differences between the North and the South. And so you will want to remember, for example, that Lazio, Campania, Abruzzo, Molise, Puglia, Basilicata, Calabria, and Sicilia, that they're all southern regions, closer in proximity to other Mediterranean cultures, and have a slightly different historical development. Okay. So